My name is David Eves. Last year at the summit here, I gave a talk about kind of how we're doing open data wrong. And my main point about talk was that actually often what ends up happening is we create these open data portals and kind of functionally they're modern day photocopiers. The point of the open data portal is just to share records with the public in the hopes that people out there will make use of it. But it doesn't actually fundamentally alter and change the way that we as government are consumers of data and the way that we build our processes and our applications around them. And so my challenge to both Socrata and to the people in the room was, you've got to stop putting your open data portal at the top of your stack, which is kind of this thing that you do at the end of everything, and start thinking about your open data portal as actually being at the very bottom of your stack. That's the core repository for data that you guys happen to have, and that all your applications internally and externally are built on top of it, and that you're really using it to drive internal consumption. And part of my point here is that I think that the kind of the business case for external consumption is not going to be very compelling in the short term. And so if you're going to have to be justifying why you're doing, kind of thinking about open data and doing it, and that the short-term justifications will be much more powerful when you get internal wins. And a large amount of that's not going to come from building an app. It's going to come from all sorts of analysis and finding kind of efficiencies or ways that we could deliver services more effectively. So that's kind of some context sharing for what prompted this panel. Some people got relatively excited. Kevin Merritt got so excited he felt he had to come down on stage and explain what Socrata was doing in light of this. But some people in the room, I think, got excited about it. And so Tyler, actually, who's the Chief Digital Officer for the state of Connecticut, approached Socrata and said, I really liked David's talk last year. It's really caused me to think about some things differently, and so I want to come share some stories. So Tyler, tell us a little bit about what brought you here.
Okay, so just a little background on me. I'm Chief Data Officer for the state of Connecticut. I work for what's called our Office of Policy and Management, which is not an IT shop. We're best known for budget stuff. We do a few other things as well. And before we had an open data portal and before we had an executive order and that sort of stuff, some folks came to me and said, hey, we're thinking about creating this chief data officer position, and it's going to be, about sharing data within the organization. And oh, by the way, we're going to do this whole open data thing, and there's going to be an executive order. And I was like, yeah, I kind of like the chief data officer title. That sounds nice. I could get into that. It's like, yeah, I don't know if I'm all that excited about the open data part of this. And it has nothing to do with not wanting to be transparent or any of that stuff, but I kind of looked around and said, we kind of do this stuff already, we just don't really do it well, right? So you can go to our Department of Education and get some spreadsheets about graduation rates, and you can go over here, and I said, well, if we're just kind of building a better mousetrap, I'm not sure I'm really that excited about what this job's going to be, but I do like the opportunity to share data sort of horizontally across our organization. So that, all right, well, maybe I can make them both work. And so I sort of, then we issue this executive order, and we've got to get 100 data sets published by March 31st, because that's what the governor wants. And so you kind of get caught up in this hype cycle where we're really just about kind of pushing data out, pulling some stuff together. So when I came here and I heard David kind of make this photocopier reference, I said, that's all I'm really doing here. I'm just taking stuff from here and putting it over here. We've got a couple things that were never released before. So in Connecticut, believe it or not, you couldn't get a list of schools in a readable format other than a 400-page PDF document. So I thought that was pretty cool that we were able to do that. But at the end of the day, I just wasn't sort of excited about it. So I think what I took away was, all right, we do need to get a little bit deeper into our technology stack, because it's the only way we're really going to drive some change internally and make this a more efficient process. Because if we're just asking people to do the same thing differently, it's the incentive for us, and especially in state government, just isn't there. It's already being done.
So can you give an example where you've been able to find a place where an internal use has taken place and you were able to help kind of bridge a gap or bring people together and access something that couldn't previously access, that changed something?
So on a real simple example, we have in Connecticut, we have an enterprise licensing database. So what that is something that we use to license everyone from doctors to plumbers to daycares, hospitals, like 100 different types of licenses and credentials. And one of the things that I kept hearing from an agency was, so, okay, person who manages daycares. I want the list of daycares. I think that has sort of a personal use case for me. I have a kid. And they said, well, we could give you that, but it'll be out of date as soon as we do, right? And so, oh, geez. Like, how many times have people heard that if you're into publishing data, right? We can give you that, but it'll be out of date as soon as we publish it. And I said, okay, well, where does this live? It lives in this enterprise licensing database. So what I found out is that it has all this great stuff in here. So just as a simple example, there was a hurricane coming. We thought maybe it was going to come to Connecticut. We're doing all this stuff, and people started sending around emails like, does anybody have a list of gas stations in the state? It was like, actually, we did right here in this enterprise licensing database. So I was able to just kind of say, here you go. Here's a list of gas stations. By the way, we have grocery stores, pharmacies, a bunch of stuff that people would be interested in preparing for an emergency. So that's sort of just like a real simple, thing that, quite frankly, I have a background in doing some emergency management stuff. It was like a nightmare to try to get that.
I always find it interesting that, like, there's often this desire to listen to people who are outside of government, like, what does the hacker want, who, may or may not actually know very much about a given service, but actually there's often not an effort to listen internally. That example struck me as interesting because you were like, I have a background in emergency preparation, so maybe your ear was more tuned. Right. How does one become, like, how do you develop an ear for internal users? Like, do you just have to go and pound doors, or like, what happens?
Well, so, and part of the approach I took too is like, let's take open data totally out of the conversation here and just have a better understanding of what the data we have is and where it lies, right? So if the conversation is totally centered around what are you willing to publish, that's a loss leader, okay? It should be what do you have and at what level can it become public? And so one of the things I discovered is we have some issues going on in Connecticut centered around juvenile justice, and in particular, kids that enter the juvenile justice system. Some of them enter into sort of a secure facility, some of them enter into sort of a community-based program, and we're taking like this sort of big look at what happens to these kids. And the thing I would hear over and over again is we don't know, right? So if we don't follow up with these kids at some point after release or re-entry into the community, and we're not tracking something like, did they get a job, did they graduate high school, the thought is that they don't know. That's totally incorrect. We actually know what happens to these kids, okay? We have data on these kids. They live in different places, right? So we know that this person might have gone into school, and we can actually tell how well they do in school. We can also tell if they enter the correctional system down the road at some point in time. We can even figure out if they're in the workforce and how much they work. We have all of this data, but the concept was, like, if I'm not tracking it, it doesn't exist, and therefore we'll never know the answers to these questions.
It's super interesting. For me, there's a huge opportunity, and where I kind of struggle with is like, does that mean you have to go, like, do you have to become the ultimate librarian and know every data set in the state, so that whenever someone pops up, you're like, oh, actually there is a data, like, is that like the end game, or is there something better?
Well, I think, I mean, that's kind of like what I am now, right? So even I'm probably, my phone's buzzing with people, hey Tyler, do you know if we have data on this? And I'm becoming the sort of human data portal, which is fine. I mean, there's like some longevity in that, I think, more so. So I mean, I guess it goes along with the title, and somebody said that to me, but I think ultimately we're trying to get to a place where rather than having more of like a metadata repository, so that we have an understanding of these are the systems we have, these are the products we can generate from a lot of these secure systems. I mean, at the state level, there's really a very distinct line between some of our public and non-public data that creates a lot of friction, especially with sort of open data advocates in the community. Like, we manage a Medicaid system that, it's claims, right? These are medical claims. So that is not open data, right? I mean, no way is that ever going to be open and available. Same with education data. But at some level, we can start to make more information available for research purposes and other things like that. But that was really the sort of goal to me, is to really just kind of say, okay, we have data on Medicaid. It lives in an Oracle database, and it contains 2 billion records, and it's protected by HIPAA. Over here, we have educational records. It lives in this system. And we do warehousing, and we index that, and we do all this stuff so that we can start to understand, okay, there's a threshold at which we can share this internally, right, so that we can make decisions for ourselves. Then there's another threshold at which it can be made publicly available.
So I think it was interesting you said like, my phone might be buzzing because people are gonna, so how do people come to know that you're that guy? Like, how did you become the guy who, like, did people just, there was this like awareness across the organization that like, oh, if I don't know, I should call Tyler?
There is a bit of that. I think, so because I was doing sort of this policy work, so what my job was like, all right, hey, we want to take a look at this, and you're kind of a smart guy, and you know how to make, you know, maps and charts and, you know, crunch all this stuff and figure it out. So, you know, can you go to this agency and this agency? We're trying to study. One thing I worked on is we don't have counties in Connecticut, which is a fun fact a lot of people don't know. So we have these things called regional planning organizations, and now they're called councils of government. We've had 15 of them in a state, you know, of like 3 million people, like probably too many. And so we had to do a study to try to consolidate these and come up with what logical regions were. So, you know, we'd go around and pull data from different agencies to try to do that. So that was a type of thing that I might work on. Another fun fact is that because we used to have 8 counties and they were abolished, we could not have 8 councils of government. Because we could have 9, we could have 7, we could not have 8. So that was also
interesting. So for me, there's kind of the interesting thing to call out is like your role is less technical than it is actually about being able to link problems to data sets and kind of being. I mean, I worry about going to this word, but actually I do feel like librarian is like an interesting word to think about in these ways. Like when you think about like a librarian in like the kind of the downtown library in your hometown, it's the kind of person you can walk to and be like, hey, I really like science fiction, or I really like romance novels, and it's like you can kind of actually throw like these like 90,000 different genres at them, and they're like, what's good? And they'll go, and maybe they know the answer, and if they don't know, well, here's the right place that we would go look, and then they'll go and look with you, and they can kind of connect, you know, you to a solution. You're kind of similar. You can connect like problems to data and have ways of thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard this term used a bunch over the last day and a half or so, which is this is not really a technology problem and that sort of a thing. And so, no, I mean, I know enough to be dangerous with a lot of different database stuff, and, you know, I know how to get stuff out of it and make people nervous. But I kind of look at myself more like a relationship builder. So just as an example, we have this sort of advocacy group who was looking for data on the number of kids per town and whether or not they have asthma. And they kept going to our Department of Public Health saying, we want asthma data. And they kept coming back to them saying, we don't have data on the number of kids per town who have asthma. And said, well, actually they don't. But what they do have is a survey by town that's conducted at schools that tells you whether kids in those schools in that town have asthma. Right. So what you're doing is asking them the wrong question, okay? Because they don't perceive themselves to be able to answer the question or provide you with the data that you're looking for, because they can't tell you how many kids in each town have asthma. They can tell you that there's a survey that's conducted that approximates that. But this is the reality that you're kind of dealing with in government, right? Like we want to give you what you're looking for, we want to give you the right thing, but the sort of flexibility to say, well, we don't have that, but we do have this, sometimes doesn't exist.
So I think one question I then have is, I'm a big believer that we need wins. Like you need to have wins for a program. You can't just go on. Like so if you have an open data program, it can't just be sitting there not really.
Sure.
You can actually be doing amazing things, but if people don't feel like it's having wins, then I actually worry about its sustainability. And I'm a big believer that internal wins are actually easier to get over certainly the medium term. After like the first hackathon's over, that's like your short-term win, and then like you're hooped. So have you, like, and the answer doesn't have to be yes, but I'm curious, like, have you had like, you've told some good stories, but do you have like an internal win that you feel the organization recognizes as a win?
Well, I think you heard our state comptroller speak yesterday. A lot of people were here for that. We're sort of a separate groups. But their data actually resides in our repository, and then they stick the sort of Socrata apps on top of that. So we actually have a lot of internal use cases where we were setting up some business intelligence around, you know, how much we're spending, where we've done some stuff actually behind the scenes with agencies sort of creating their own little dashboards on how they're spending versus kind of clicking through the Socrata products itself. I've actually used it like to see if my purchase order has been cut, like if I ask someone whether that's happened, I got to go through 15 people, but I can dig into this thing and go, oh yeah, it's actually been paid, so my laptop should be here in a couple days. I think that's one. Another one that I think has been really interesting for us has to do with traffic stop data. We're one of the few states that publishes raw sort of incident level traffic stops for every community in the state. And they were collected in an effort to determine whether or not racial profiling is occurring during this. And sort of the story that I told was that this data can't actually answer the question for which it's collected, because like the ratio of different races and when they're pulled over doesn't really approximate the driving population. So people that are driving into Hartford, their sort of demographics are far different from the community itself. So you can't get to that level. But you can do some interesting things with it, like when people are ticketed, because it tells you what time, what the outcome of the stop was. So we've been able to really dig in and kind of say, okay, our traffic enforcement things that the state police do on these dates, they actually result in increased ticketing. We've been able to identify some real trends associated with that, both internally and externally, for a purpose totally unrelated to why that data is actually collected. So that's been sort of an interesting exercise for us.
And who decides, like, how does the wing, like, does like the, like, how do you know, like, like, does the governor say something, or like, I don't think it's that, like, how does the culture understand that it's a win?
So, like, this is a job, like, nobody calls me up and says, like, hey, Tyler, great job publishing those farmers markets, man, like, that's awesome. And the same, like, I don't get a lot of credit for something, that's fine with me. I think what you see, like I got an app mention on Twitter because some journalist was like digging into this traffic stop data. And so it's sort of seeing the use continue, and like we monitor our traffic, so we're seeing this sort of traffic from within the state continue to increase over time. So that's really the way I would sort of quantify a win. Like there's no certificate or there's no plaque, and the governor doesn't call and say, I really appreciate you doing this. I do think that as you see traffic grow, you understand that use is happening. I mean, we're having API calls. I see one thing we just had is an API spun up for this enterprise licensing data, because we have an application that lets you look up a license, but somebody's building a better one now. The old one was sort of wonky, and now they're building a better one, which is great.
I actually feel like the fact that your phone rings and people are coming and asking you is maybe that's like the sign of success, because it indicates that like if tomorrow someone said, oh, we're going to get rid of all this, there'd be this diffuse complaint of like, no, actually I was kind of relying on Tyler to get me data to answer questions for me, and it's like kind of the diffuse pushback across the organization would probably be your best defense. Having an application build helps, but that actually is a wonderful defense to have of kind of how the program is working.
Sure, yeah, so we have a publication that sort of follows what we're doing. It's an online publication, and they sort of scooped the story before we rolled out doing an open data thing, and then they did this follow-up. I found out they had interviewed Walter Jakewith as part of it, which I kind of didn't, I was a little nervous on what the result of the article itself was going to be. But they interviewed some of our users, and it was interesting. Like one of them actually said, yeah, now I know Tyler, and I can call him and ask him questions, and he gets back to me. And I do see that. I mean, you hear the stories of Chicago and how their sort of folks went out and met with the civic tech group that was going there, and that it was about a person, that you can identify with. Connecticut's a little different. I mean, our population overall is like the size of Chicago. So like creating that sort of civic hacking and civic technology culture is a little bit different. Our biggest city is like 125,000 people, and they're all sort of spread out. We do have some really cool things going on in New Haven, but a lot of our users are more on the policy side. And so being able to engage with these people overall and just kind of have the conversation with them, I think is a little more valuable than just sort of the portal itself.
Cool. I think we're starting to run short on time, so, oh, no, that's excellent. That's good. I thought we only had 20 minutes. I feel like I've actually been really wanting to ask these questions because I want to nerd out on the internal use, because I do actually think it's enormously important, but I kind of want to open the floor. Anybody here have a question they want to be asking Tyler? Yeah.
I'm sort of a colleague from another state. How are you set up? What department? Do you have a team, or is it just you?
I work in our Office of Policy and Management, which is sort of a budget office. It's just me. I'm an office of one. And then we have what we call an agency data officer. So it's the equivalent of a liaison that we've required each agency to have, and they have some roles and responsibilities around sort of implementing it.
You guys try to understand that I'm an army of one, so much that it's like that.
Yeah.
At the back.
Were each of the agency officers required to put together the, I guess, your data inventory for that agency? How did you go about sort of understanding your universe?
So we took a little bit of a different approach, and this is one of those things that, like in retrospect, maybe I would change. So we sort of went after the low-hanging fruit initially, which was stuff that's kind of already out there and ready to go and doesn't require a lot of effort. So that was their job, and now we're sort of taking this next step with sort of a more formal data inventory, and so they're sort of responsible for that. What we're not doing is a data set inventory, and what we're not doing is sending around an Excel spreadsheet saying, fill this out and like send it back to me in 30 days. I tend to go and sit with people and talk to them about a specific database or a specific issue we might want to look into in order to sort of ascertain the stuff you might want to start to put into that. So I would suggest like the emailing spreadsheets out to people and having them fill it out and then send it back to you. I know it's worked for some. I just think it's better to maybe have a conversation about it.
I actually met, but for me the reason why I think it probably doesn't work in some cases is it probably says something about the culture of the organization. Where it doesn't work is it's a compliance issue now. It's like, I get this spreadsheet, I gotta fill it out to a guy that I don't even report to do something I don't even really care about. I'm like, if I don't do it, he probably won't notice. Maybe he'll only get in 30 days, and then I'll do it then. You know, I can sit there and like, it's not hard to imagine the incentive structure that creates the outcome that you don't want. Whereas if you go and sit down with someone and you say, what are your problems? Hey, did you know this data set exists and this? And you actually help them think about how you are trying to help their problem. And they're like, oh, and by the way, like, what data sets do you have? Because I'm having this like, you've now totally changed how they see what you were trying to do and their willingness. They might actually be willing to do the spreadsheet at that point. But you need to have that conversation with them first.
Yeah, so I'll even give you, like, I had a relatively simple question at one point in time. I wanted a list of all the doctors in the state that accepted Medicaid. The reason I wanted that is because I wanted to see how many of them were near public transportation. And I thought if we can make it easier, so like you could look up your doctor and get directions and figure out if you could take transit, but you can't pick your doctor based on their proximity to transit in sort of a broader perspective. So it's like, give me the list of doctors that accept Medicaid. And it went into like this black hole. So I thought, all right, now I gotta go talk to these people, great. And so what I found out is that this isn't actually the easiest thing to produce. Okay, fair enough. And ultimately what it is we have a database that controls like eligibility and your entrance into certain programs and whether you can be a provider. And so you could maybe be a Medicaid provider, and there's different tiers of Medicaid. So there's children's Medicaid, which in Connecticut we call Husky, and then there's like regular Medicaid. And so now we have children's Medicaid doctors and adult Medicaid doctors, right? And they change constantly. So in order to sort of understand that, you have to have that conversation. It seems so simple, right? Just give me a list of the doctors. And it turns out that you have to kind of go through two things and get there. And now if you want to find out how many people receive Medicaid benefits per town and how much they do, that's an entirely different question to ask as well. So these things that seem so simple, right? Like, just tell me how much you spend on Medicaid. Well, it's not that simple because it's claims-based, and then you overpay them, and now we have a spreadsheet of like when we get reimbursed. And so, I mean, that's why you really have to have these conversations with people.
Do you have a data policy?
Yes.
an executive order, I believe you said at the beginning.
So we have an executive order, and then it says, I shall create a data policy and any other rules that I feel are necessary to implement the order.
The power.
Yeah, I know, that is, like, I've yet to wield any other rules at this point, but we do have a very short open data policy.
That you can amend it. You can amend at any time. Have you ever
Right.
been in a meeting with someone and been like, I'm now officially amending my policy to force you to give this to me right now? That's a powerful stick.
I'd like to wield that, but then I don't actually have there's no penalty that I can impose upon
Exactly. This
somebody.
phantom stick is enormous.
So I do work in the budget office, so I'm like, well, you know, talk to them, but
Implicit threat and implicit threat. I like it. Implicit threat. Good.
Could you talk about how you engage with departmental folks and get them to, I'm not sure to what level you're doing this, but get them to be populating the data portal for you, doing the ETL stuff or whatever you need to do to get it up there in a clean, quality manner, and talk about that, because you're, like we referred to, they're not your direct reports, so how does that whole thing work, and what successes have you had?
So you could also sort of on a parallel to diving into the data stack, you could be like parallel diving into the people stack, right? Mm-hmm. So like you've got an agency head, and then you've got, a couple of layers of middle management, and you have somebody who actually like knows the data and knows all about it. And you really have to get down to that level of individual and to understand, they know more about that than anybody else does. Typically what you experience in this is at the management level, it's like the loss of control or the fear of, making them look bad. Usually the staff are pretty excited about being able to do this, they'd rather do it this way. Now, then the question becomes, okay, is this in a database? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it a shapefile? If it's like a real sort of database and it's updated a lot, we'll figure out and help them automate it. We've got some tools to do that. Otherwise, we'll just say, hey, you can have an account, you can publish, and do it according to our rules.
Who's authorizing your data publication?
In terms of,
So for data that gets pushed out to the open data portal, is that being the final publication coming from departments, from you, from a third party? Who's authorizing the publication?
So it would typically, we'll let the agencies, we sort of say, here's the broad overarching goals, it's your responsibility to figure out how to do it. This agency data officer is responsible for making sure that we're not publishing, personally identifiable stuff. I can assure you at the state level, no one's clamoring to publish protected data. It's generally we're trying to say, hey, can you disaggregate this? Instead of just giving me a count by town, can you break it out by age or sex or some type of demographic level, just something a little more detailed. So our struggle hasn't been somebody really wanting to publish something they shouldn't.
Jessica.
You mentioned it's important to understand what data you have and then determine the level of public access to that data. For the data that you're not releasing to the public, how are you managing and promoting increased internal data sharing, not only across agencies, but with local entities?
So that's an interesting question. One of the things we did in Connecticut was actually we passed a law that authorizes my agency to enter into, basically says, we'll go to an agency, we'll request that they enter into a data sharing agreement, and they shall enter into one with us when we ask them to. And in essence, what that does is it will allow us to sort of pull data from across agencies, and then we could enter into, particularly on the sensitive side of things, we would be like a one-stop shop for a researcher or somebody looking to gain access to, let's say, de-identified record-level data under a data sharing agreement. So we did put sort of a legal structure in place for that. The technology side of that's a little bit different than what we would typically look at from an open data perspective. And plus you get into things like probabilistic matching and integration and stuff like that that's can be unwieldy as well. But we put a legal framework in place for the time being, trying to move that ball forward.
Cool. Any other questions? Sorry, yeah.
Tacking on to her question, so within the governmental agencies that you're dealing with, you don't share the data among them. I can understand on the outside, because I'm looking at it from the perspective that I have 3 different entities. I have the external, Joe Public, and I have the internals inside of my organization, excuse me, and then I have at my department level that I can share data. So I'm trying to figure out, have you gotten to that internal part of sharing inside of agencies that can share the data?
So that's the real sort of legal struggle. So if you're talking about Department of Labor wage data, only Department of Labor technically is authorized to access that unless you have some type of legal agreement in place. Yeah, excuse me. And so same thing with education data, right? If you want student level data and you want to share that, it can only be done, again, under certain terms for certain purposes. So program evaluation or whatever it is. We're trying to get out of the business of every time I want to do this, I have to enter into a separate legal agreement, but to sort of, how can we streamline this process but still protect and comply with the law? So it's a real struggle to share meaningful, valuable data that can tell us about the outcomes of our programs within state government, at least. The technology is part to blame, but also the sort of legal structure can make it difficult as well.
Tyler, how long have you been in this role?
Like 2 years, maybe? I lost track after like 6 months.
And you were the first person to have the role?
I am, yeah.
Okay. And what do you, so succession planning will happen at some point. What are you going to tell the next person? Like, what's the thing what's the number one thing or one or two things they got to be doing?
Again, I think it is primarily it's almost like a sales job. I don't know, I just talked to like Ewan or somebody, maybe you can give me a few tips on this. I'm selling people a concept though, right? Not a product, but a concept. And so there has to be something in it for them at the end of the day. And so you have to kind of make them understand how they benefit from it. So this is sort of my sales pitch. And I sort of stole it from somebody else, but he's a smart guy. I'm sure he won't mind if I use it. So in government, we sort of embrace this concept, managing data as an asset, except it's not a traditional asset, right? So any asset, either its value is based on its availability, so the more of it that exists, the less valuable it becomes, or the more it's used, the less valuable it becomes. Like, right, your car, as soon as you drive it off the lot, it's worth less than it was. That's not true for data. I think we all understand that the more data that's available, the more valuable each individual data set is, and then in turn, the more data is used, the more valuable it is. So that makes that person, right, that person deep in that data stack, incredibly valuable, right? If they can look at it as not, like, I'm not giving up control, but I actually know more about this incredibly valuable asset than anybody else, right? That makes them much more valuable to the organization. So they need to kind of perceive their value in that way, not as like, you have to go through me to get it, and that's what makes me valuable to the organization. So that's the sales pitch I give people. Maybe it's working, I don't know. I think it's
Cool. Thanks so much, everybody. This was a lot of fun. How do people reach you? Twitter handles?
I'm at ttclaycamp. Yeah, you can follow me. I don't tweet very much. Every once in a while.
Email address?
tyler.claycamp@ct.gov. And that's, you can just Google me. There's no other, like, I'm not John Smith, right?
Right.
Yeah, I'm on the app.
Yeah. Excellent.
So,
Awesome. So thank you so much.
yeah, thanks a lot.